Today we are going to ask a question. What kind of church did Jesus envision? This is such an important question and one that I have been obsessed with my entire Christian life, and I would love to unpack some thoughts about this with you guys. So my name is Jeremy Pryor. I'm with 1000 Houses or 1kh.org, where we are activating households to disciple the city, and we care a lot about what the church is because we want to be obedient to Jesus. We want to live our lives in a way that is consistent with his teaching. So let's walk through how to even unpack or think about how to answer this question. What kind of church did Jesus envision? So is this what Jesus had in mind? There was a tweet that went viral a couple weeks ago where there was the spring Spanish procession of these guys in pointed hats going through a Spanish city, and it erupted a whole firestorm of conversation around the images of this procession because it looks so strange to us. Now, part of it is there's a little bit of a KKK kind of imagery that triggers Americans that I think doesn't help the situation. But I appreciated the conversation because this is a question I think we really need to ask. When you see expressions of the church and there's a part of you that says, is that what Jesus had in mind? I think that's a good question to ask. And I think that we are being trained almost to not think about the answer to that question. So when you think about the way that things started around a table, a bunch of disciples, Jesus teaching them, a first century sort of Jewish context. And then you see what we've created from that, these kinds of really elaborate, in some cases, church traditions, or you can also talk about the Protestant tradition and all the denominations and all the different traditions that are happening there. When do we actually go back and ask the question, okay, what did Jesus have in mind? Like, at what point do we audit our practices and ask, is this really what he originally thought about? So that's what I want to do. And I'll just kind of walk you guys through how I think about this. I'm going to do this in a few parts, but I really want to start with just Jesus. Then I'm going to go into the book of Acts. And later on, I would love to unpack some of the things from the epistles, but I really want to just hang around this first initial question. So I love to ask the question, if you never experienced church, but only read the New Testament, what would you think the church would look like? Now one of the things that's kind of fun today is, I don't know if I've put this question in AI and I'm always like, it immediately spits out exactly what I would imagine the church would look like. In other words, this is not a complicated question to answer. It's pretty easy to answer. What's complicated is the forces that are trying to stop us from asking this question. That is what we need to really grapple with. And there are really three things, or three kinds of ways to think about the forces that will try to stop you from asking this question. So the first is the decision in theology. In so many cases, when it comes to church theology, or what we call ecclesiology, we favor post hoc versus first principles reasoning. In other words, we start with what is. Okay, we got church buildings, we got pastors, we got priests in some cases, and then we go and looking in Scripture for, okay, it looks like they also had a pastor. Ooh, there's a verse about that in Ephesians 4. Maybe this, we're not starting with first principles and slowly building our understanding of the church. We start with how we experience church, and then we try to read those experiences back into the Bible. A real obvious example of this is when there's a conversation around church buildings, people are oftentimes thinking and are reasoning from reading back into, there was a Jewish temple, and so we need to treat our church buildings the way that we treat the temple, or we need to think about the importance of church buildings. And most theologians will say, okay, that's just obvious post hoc reasoning. That's not why church buildings got developed. Nobody was sitting down, reading the Old Testament, looking at the example of the temple, and then turning and saying, okay, how do we replicate that? That's not exactly how it happened, but that's often how reasoning happens in the church, and we need to be really careful of that. So I'm going to be pointing out examples of post hoc versus first principles reasoning. The second issue is entrenched interests. So we also don't want to ask this question because, as Upton Sinclair says, it is difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on his not understanding it. Do you understand? It is really hard to have this conversation because there is a lot at stake. You can't just have a disinterested conversation with people that have made their entire life centered around the current traditions of church and ask them to have a disinterested conversation around this topic. They get triggered almost instantly. And there's just so many defense mechanisms that rush to the surface to try to stop this conversation from happening because those entrenched interests are really, really strong. And there is a lot at stake for those folks. I just think that we have to be really careful not to allow those kinds of issues to really cloud us. If we're following Jesus as Lord, then we need to be okay with having a relaxed conversation about this kind of theology without getting so triggered. But this is the reason why it's triggered. It's really an economic reason at the very base of it. Sometimes there's also an identity reasons, but I think the economic reason is really powerful, and that's what Upton Sinclair is saying here. You always want to be careful when you're reasoning with someone and the cost to them to agree or even understand what you're saying is enormous, and the cost to you is almost zero. Like, that needs to be brought to the surface, and we need to be aware. And that's what in the whole legal profession they talk about in terms of conflicts of interest. There is an enormous conflict of interest that current career-minded professional Christians, clergy, has in this issue. And so they're the ones who are ultimately sharing with us what they think this is, and that's where we go to for our teaching. And we have to understand this Upton Sinclair dilemma exists in a powerful way. The third one is, are you running an us versus them filter or a truth versus falsehood filter? In other words, oftentimes what happens in these conversations is when we're reading post hoc, reading our practices, traditions back into Scripture, we're oftentimes very protective of our team, our tribe, our way of doing things, and we can be very aggressive against those who aren't. So you see this, of course, on the football field. If there's a really close call, it's not like everyone in football is running a truth versus false filter. And so you're just as likely to have people from the home team who would be disadvantaged by this call agreeing with the ref if it goes against them. That's not what happens in those stadiums, because they're not running a truth versus false filter. They're running an us versus them filter. And this is very dangerous for Christians. Paul says in 2 Thessalonians, he talks about this deception that's going to come over the world. And he says, because they refuse to love the truth and so be saved, therefore God sends them a strong delusion so they may believe what is false. In other words, when you decide not to love the truth, when you decide to go with an us-them filter, when you decide to go tribal instead of truth-false, then basically, in this case, it says that God sends you a delusion so that you will believe what is false, because this is a judgment on those who refuse to love the truth. And so what you have to do to approach this whole topic is you have to resist post hoc reasoning, you have to admit any conflicts of interest, and you have to love the truth to get to anywhere close. It doesn't mean that what I'm going to share with you guys is right. I'm just saying even having these conversations is extraordinarily difficult. Okay, so one of the ways I'm going to go about this just systematically is from what theologians like to call the principle of first mention. In other words, a lot of times when you're building a theology, you can just look at every single verse in the Bible that refers to that thing and try to systemize it all. But the Bible really is unveiled in sort of progressive revelation or as a story that's unfolding. And so oftentimes the story itself assumes that you're doing this kind of first principles, first mention kind of thing, where you're aware of previous ways that this topic has been talked about. And so you want to be building from the foundations up, right? And you will see, it doesn't mean that future scriptures can't help you interpret those more foundational scriptures. It just means that it's really useful to actually think about it first from this perspective. Start from how this thing emerged, okay? And so a lot of people can choose different places where they can start. I'm trying to answer this specific question, like what was in Jesus's mind? What did he envision? And so I'm going to be really parked in the Gospels, of course, to really give us an understanding of that. So this is going to be ultimately where we're going to go. I'm going to unveil these things one at a time. But you can see that I want to start from a foundational understanding and then work my way up. This is what first principles reasoning looks like, where you start at the bottom. And so if you're looking at this visual, you can see I'm trying to start from the bottom and working my way up and then be sort of shaped and form my thinking from the foundations up. Post hoc reasoning looks like this. We start with what is, and then we try to reinterpret everything. And the chance of getting it wrong when you do post hoc reasoning is extremely high. So I'm trying to avoid that. I'm trying to do first principles reasoning. Okay, so we're going to start with this one. Why do I think the foundation of thinking about the nature of how Jesus envisioned the church as family? Because of something he said in Mark 10. So this is a fascinating passage where a man comes to Jesus and asks how it can be saved, and the rich young ruler, we call him. And at the very end of this, the disciples start freaking out because this guy decides to walk away because he's wealthy. The disciples are like, well, we gave up everything to follow you. And then Jesus unveils his vision for a future community. So this is why it's so important. So I would say this is like an inkling that Jesus is giving. He's trying to encourage his disciples, but he's encouraging them by talking about the future. And he says, truly I say to you, there is no one who has left house or brothers or sisters or mother or father or children or lands for my sake and for the gospel, who will not receive 100-fold now in this time houses, brothers, sisters, mothers, children, and lands with persecutions, and in the age to come eternal life. Wow. this is what he expected to really encourage the disciples. He's like, yes, you are going to have to give up everything. There's a lot of people are going to sell everything they have, but it's not like they're going to be penniless and walking around homeless. They're going to get 100 times more brothers, sisters, mothers, lands, which really refers to like businesses, right? Fields, houses. Like, this is amazing. Children, even, he says. So what he really is giving them a picture to kind of encourage their hearts in this story is a vision of a future loving, huge extended family. And so when you think about church, I oftentimes start from this perspective. I really want to understand the incredibly tight relationship within first century Jewish families. And then imagine that Jesus is saying, like, you're going to be a part of that extended kind of family. There's a great book that was recently published, says its title is When the Church Was a Family. And it really explores the incredible sibling bonds that happened in the first century Jewish family, and how this was really designed to be the foundational sort of building block from which we understand the way that Jesus envisioned how this church would actually feel, like how it would look, okay? So that's the first one. We're just going to start at the foundational level with family. Now we're going to go into the second one. I'm just calling it the confession, and this is a really important passage, okay? So in Matthew 16, Jesus says to the disciples, who do you say that I am? And there's a lot of people who have very different positions on this passage, but we have to deal with it because this is the first time Jesus uses the word church, this word ecclesia, that's going to become so important to us if we're going to try to understand the nature of the church. Okay, so this is in Matthew 16. It says, but he said to them, but who do you say that I am? Simon Peter replied, you are the Christ. Now the Christ is the Greek word for Messiah. You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And Jesus answered him, blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church. Okay, there's the word church for the first time in the New Testament. And the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Then he strictly charged the disciples to tell no one that he was the Messiah, the Christ. Okay, so what's going on here? And there are really two positions with regards to this passage. I think it's like when Jesus was asking them, who do you say that I am? Was Jesus' response to Peter to say, okay, you're right, Peter, and you are the Pope, like you are the leader, and I'm going to build my entire kingdom on you and the successive apostolic line that is going to emanate from you? Or was he saying this confession that Peter declared, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God, which was not being said openly at that time? This was a revelation, Jesus says. And of course, at the end of this, he doesn't command them, don't tell them anything about Peter. Don't tell people that Peter's the leader or Peter's the Pope. He says at the end, don't tell anybody that he was the Messiah. He was the Christ. There's also a thing about binding and loosing we're going to go a little bit deeply into in the next passage. So I'll unpack what he means by that. But I think that he means the confession. N.T. Wright points out that even within Catholic circles, there was a consensus, in his opinion. I'm not a New Testament theologian in the way he is, but there was a Catholic consensus that this passage was actually about the confession, not about Peter being the Pope until much later. I think that there's a debate to be had about that. But I think it's really important to understand. I think this is such an important question. We need to answer this one way or the other, because in terms of the principle of first mention, this is the first time this word ecclesia is being used, that Jesus is suggesting that this new ecclesia, this new assembly, this new governing structure, this new church is going to emerge. And so we need to understand what he's talking about here. And I think that foundationally what he's saying is that the church is going to be absolutely founded like a solid rock on the confession of Jesus being the Messiah, the Son of God. That was the confession. Now, if you read the rest of the New Testament, that really bears out, right? Paul says this really shocking thing in Romans 10. He says, if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. The simplest passage or verse, the entire New Testament about the mechanism of salvation is the confession that Jesus is Lord. In other words, going back to Matthew 16, Paul is saying, look, this is what does it. And of course, when you look at a book like First John, John is just constantly wrestling with people. Say, the Antichrist says that Christ is not the Son of God, that he has not come in the flesh. So what they were trying to do is found a new community on this confession. That's what I believe. And I think if you believe that this is all about Peter, then you're going to come to completely radically different conclusions. And so it's really important to get this settled, or just to know for yourself what you think. But I believe That what Jesus is envisioning now is a family that all confesses that Jesus is Lord, that Jesus is King. That's the word Messiah. That Jesus is this coming anointed one who is going to be the ruler, right? And so that the focus of the confession is on the identity of Jesus, not the identity of Peter, the identity of Jesus. And so we need to get that right. Now, if you have an entire community that's acting like a family that all is confessing the same thing about the identity of Jesus, then they're unified. Okay, there's only one other time in the entire Gospels that the word church is mentioned. The word ecclesia is only used twice. It's only used in the book of Matthew. It's only used in Matthew 16 and in Matthew 18. So we've started with family. Now we move through the confession. So you've got a family of confessing people. What happens next? Fascinating thing. Jesus then, I believe, begins to describe the emergence of a parallel government. The church was intended to be a kingdom, and this kingdom would function the way a government functions. You can really tease that out in many passages. He's constantly talking about the kingdom of God. I've always been confused about why does Jesus talk about a kingdom and Paul talk about a church? There is no confusion if you understand that the definition of the word ecclesia. Ecclesia was a governmental word in the first century. It's a very common word. I was reading a book recently about around 200 or 300 BC, and they were using the word ecclesia over and over again because this was the absolute foundation of the way that people thought about their government. And so we're going to talk about that. And this really comes out in a passage in Matthew 18. So Jesus is talking about how to resolve conflicts within this ecclesia. And so he uses the word ecclesia, again, for the second and the last time in the Gospels. If your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. If he listens to you, you have gained your brother. But if he does not listen, take one or two others along with you, that every charge may be established by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. If he refuses to listen to them, tell it to the word church, ecclesia. And if he refuses to listen even to the ecclesia, so that's the third time he uses that word, but it's only in 2 passages here in the 4 Gospels. Let him be to you as a Gentile, a tax collector. Truly I say to you, whatever you bind on earth, or he's saying this again, shall be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. Again, I say to you, if 2 of you agree on earth about anything they ask, it will be done to them by my Father in heaven. For where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there am I among them. Okay, this is again, extremely foundational and very surprising use of the word ecclesia. Jesus is saying that he wants the ecclesia to function like a judiciary. And so you see that part of what's happening here, and this was often the way an ecclesia would function in a first century village. So ecclesia is the word assembly, where you'd get people together to often make governmental decisions. And in fact, one of the really interesting facts is that one of the only times the word ecclesia is used in the New Testament where it's not translated church is in Acts 19, when there's a giant riot going on and Paul is being attacked by this sort of mob of people or about to be attacked. And there's a man who stands up and says, you guys, we are in danger of having formed an illegal ecclesia. And of course, that's translated assembly in most translations, not church, because again, this was a governmental word. But what I want you guys to hear is that we have a family. He's saying it's going to feel like an large extended family. It's going to be filled with people that understand and agree on my identity, that they are following me and that I'm King, I am Lord, I'm the Messiah, I'm the Son of God. And it's going to be a parallel ecclesia to the ecclesia of this world. Now, part of the problem, of course, is the word church. We chose to use the word church. The etymology of the word church comes from a German word named Kirk, which actually refers to a building. And so where tons of confusion has entered into this conversation is we chose to use instead of using a governmental word or just a neutral word like assembly to translate ecclesia, we used a word that referred to a building. And we've been trying to recover from that idea ever since. And so it's really important to have ringing in your head, an ecclesia is a parallel government. And so when the church gets together, they're going to make decisions. I mean, Paul talks about this over and over again in the epistles. He talks about decisions that are being made by the ecclesia to, for example, excommunicate somebody or discipline somebody. That's something that can be brought before the ecclesia. And he talks about this in 1 Corinthians, for example. It's kind of weird today that, sometimes you're in a building and then you hear church discipline happen if you've ever been in a part of the process, but you're not used to being an ecclesia. You're not actually functioning like a government. So I think it's really important to see the difference there. Okay. So far from a foundational perspective, we start with family, then the confession, then the parallel government. We're going to go one more place here, and that is the Apprenticeship Movement. So if you're trying to build a theology of how Jesus envisioned the church, they're like a family, they're confessors, they're a parallel government. But then he says something in Matthew 28 that's critical to understand to kind of round out where we're going here. And Jesus came and said to them, all authority in heaven and earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you. And behold, I am with you always to the end of the age. In other words, Jesus came to create a movement of multiplying apprentices of Jesus. He's saying, look, you guys, I'm going to leave. I have all authority. And so what I want you to do with my authority, with my kingship, with my lordship, is I want you guys to take what I've done for you in the last 3 years and apprenticing under me, and I want you to apprentice other people as well. And so make disciples, not just of anybody, but all nations. My authority extends through the entire earth, and help them, train them to observe or obey everything that I've commanded you. I'm going to be with you. I'm going to be right there in your midst. So you can imagine that the activity of the church would be centered on catalyzing a movement of apprentices of Jesus, not just disciples, but disciple makers, because he tells them to teach them to obey everything I've commanded you, which is a recursive command, which means that if you are making disciples and teaching the disciples to observe everything you've been commanded, and you've been commanded to make disciples, ergo, you need to command your disciples to also make disciples. Do you see the cycle there? That's what creates a multiplying movement of apprentices. And the method of discipleship here is an apprenticeship. That was the way Jesus did, what way first century rabbis did it as well. So we're going to stop here and just say, look, family, the confession, the parallel government, the apprenticeship movement. At this point, you have the close of the Gospels in terms of, and now there's so many verses we could have tackled, of course, but I'm trying to give you guys my picture of how I think this sort of emanates from a foundational perspective and gives you a fairly good container for understanding the vision Jesus had for the church. There's a lot of other elements we could tease out here, but I just want to clarify. This starts to really give you a sense of what this structure is for and what it looks like. It's a family of confessing believers that are setting up a parallel government in order to disciple the nations, disciple all of the people of the earth. Okay, so again, how do we go from this movement of apprentices and this extended family to this new place? We've really given in, I think, to these three blinding diseases we talked about: post hoc reasoning, entrenched interest, and us versus them filter. There are cures to this. We need to do first principles reasoning, which I'm trying to really model for you guys here. We need to serve the future instead of entrenched interest. In other words, it's really important for us to pass on to our children a better and clearer and cleaner picture of what Jesus had in mind, and not simply serve the past or the entrenched interests of the present. And then we've got to get out of this tribal us versus them filter and really make sure that we value and love the truth like Jesus described. So that's where we're headed. The next video, I'm going to add 3 more elements to this picture and kind of round out this foundational understanding of what the church was like by looking at 3 massively important passages in the book of Acts that gives us real insight into the nature of the church itself. But this gives you a snapshot of what I think Jesus envisioned when he first established this new ecclesia.
Well, friends, thanks for listening to today's episode. If you'd like to learn more about 1,000 Houses or discover what a season of coaching might look like for you and your household, visit 1kh.org. We'll see you for the next episode.